Perfect. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here today. I'm representing McKinsey & Company, the exclusive knowledge partner to FMF, and presenting the FMF Barometer. The FMF Barometer is a culmination of a very collaborative effort that's been put forth by many different organizations with the goal of being able to track the progress the world is making. The progress the world is making towards realizing a world in which we have very resilient mineral supply chains globally. When FMF started 4 or 5 years ago, there was a recognition that the world was not actually expanding supply fast enough. There was a major opportunity to be able to expand faster, not only to ensure resilient supply chains for the energy transition and the digital transition, but also a need to be able to expand in order to develop the countries of the super region. And it is within that spirit that the FMF Barometer is brought to you. The FMF Barometer is very much of a multi-stakeholder effort, which not only thinks about it from the perspective of the mining industry, but also from the perspective of regional governments. This gives you a bit of an overview of the table of contents of the FMF Barometer. It starts with a foreword, and by His Excellency the Vice Minister of Mineral Resources of Saudi Arabia that outlines the overall objectives of the report. From there, it goes in and walks through and gets a view from some of the important influencers in this sector, the CEO and chairman of the major mining companies. But it's not only the FMF Barometer which brings you their perspectives, it also brings a view on global perception, which asks the question, how does the entire world think about the mining sector and its contributions towards society? And what we saw there is a view that the mining industry really needs to reshape the narrative in terms of its contribution to society to have balanced mineral value chains. And that'll be incredibly important moving forward. But the FMF Barometer is not only about perception. There's a lot of other reports you're going to read about perception in the mining industry. It's also about facts, about supply and demand balances, about the critical infrastructure requirements that are needed to bring online a lot of new projects around the world. So from that perspective, the goal of the barometer is to track the progress the world's making towards delivering on a resilient supply chain for future industries, which is really what the whole goal of FMF ultimately was. But there was a recognition that it needed to be tracked and transparency brought to the sector, not only in terms of developing new projects, but also from the perspective of being able to involve multiple stakeholders, including local communities. This is an important aspect of the FMF, is that it takes that full value chain perspective towards development, and it also basically takes the perspective of all the enablers that are required. With the critical mineral framework that will be discussed much more in subsequent sessions, the FMF takes the view that it is a real platform to be able to get together multiple stakeholders to design interventions to be able to realize mining projects, as well as full value chain development. At the top, it's about this collaborative multilateral environment, which is really an exception in a world of increasingly regional value chains. It then goes through the different parts of the value chain and thinks not only about exploration and mining, but also that midstream processing, and recognize the important collaboration that different countries are going to have in order to get the scale needed, particularly for that downstream development. And then finally, it thinks about the enablers, and you see a lot of them listed here, from funding to talent development. Importantly, there was a recognition when writing this report that a lot of those enablers are the key gaps towards developing projects. Getting people to work in the mining sector is not easy. I see that basically in walking around, everyone has a recognition that it's hard to get people to work underground in difficult conditions. It's also difficult in many cases to be able to attract kind of also high-tech youth towards working in the mining sector. So there was a lot of efforts being expended by the mining industry towards that today. A lot of discussions on the side here, both for the barometer, but also in leadership roundtables about how to develop that next generation. So what's really driving this need, and why was the FMF created? It was created with the recognition that we were living in a world of a lot of industrial development, whether that be the growth of steel demand towards urbanization, industrialization of multiple countries. And there was a pretty clear discontinuity of growth, but it was still a lot of the same minerals and a lot of the same countries. But what we've seen recently, particularly with the growth of particularly of electric vehicles, as well as basically data centers, is there's a lot of new commodities that are really coming to the fore, whether that be commodities for high-tech sectors, for infrared, for aerospace and defense, whether that be copper for all the data centers. There's a need to be able to bring online product from, first of all, different countries. Second, in many cases, different companies than the traditional mining companies in the sector. And then finally, also, these are very different minerals. A lot of these markets were previously niche, and they're going from niche towards commodity markets with a lot of fits and starts, a lot of price spikes, a lot of huge kind of supply surges. So a lot of instability and a need to be able to track their development. So what are the 5 major trends that we found in the state of the sector that is going to be discussed a bit later throughout the proceedings? The first one is basically a recognition that we are seeing a move from a global market with a free trade to one in which we have increasing regionalized supply chains. In some cases, they're nationalized supply chains. And from that perspective, there's a recognition that the world is actually shifting away, and in building out these regional supply chains, there will have to be a much more diversified supply chain than historically was the case. If we look historically and also today, we see that in some cases, 80 to 90 to 99% of a commodity is actually produced in a single country. And there's a recognition that for these incredibly fragile value chains, there needs to be a more diversified supply chain. And FMF is trying to actively promote that, but doing so, promoting the development also of the super region so that the world that has historically not has faced that industrial development can actually experience that in developing their value chains. The second part of this is actually some of these underlying demand trends. So we talked a bit about the energy transition, also renewable energy. I mean, from the wind turbines and solar, there's been a 170% growth in renewable installations over the past 5 years. A tremendous growth which has required a lot of minerals, whether that be rare earths and wind turbines to silicon and polysilicon. We've seen exponential growth in a lot of these mineral markets in order to accommodate renewable energy. Another part of that is data center. So we expect to see roughly 350% growth moving forward, similar to what we've seen over the past 5 years, which has been really exponential. This growth is all about copper. So there's a lot of people milling about here today talking about copper. It's obviously one of the commodities of focus, and one which is basically one of the largest commodity markets globally, but one that's going to see much higher growth than something like iron ore or a commodity which is much more around industrialization, urbanization. The third one is around these critical mineral industries. So on the one hand is the demand. The other part is bringing online the supply. We've seen a tremendous growth in some of these commodities. So if we look at something like nickel in Indonesia, or lithium across multiple geographies, there's been a huge supply response. So whereas 3 or 4 years ago we were standing here, in many cases with government stakeholders being concerned about the development, we've actually seen a huge growth in supply, which has been good. So that is not necessarily the major deficit that it was once thought to be. But there are looming supply and demand gaps in other commodities. And there's also a concentration in some of the critical minerals that will require further diversification in order to increase resiliency. The fourth one is about Chinese conversion capacity. So this is obviously something we've seen a lot. It's really impacted zinc and copper TCRCs and other smelting and refining charges across the industry. The huge growth in Chinese capacity is a reflection of the country's demand. For almost every commodity, China represents somewhere between 40 to 60% of actual end-use demand. But some part of it is also depressed margins in many of the conversion industries, which is something that people are going to be looking at as they're trying to build their own regional supply chains. And the fifth thing is about government intervention. So I think, we've seen over the past year many instances of government intervention, whether that be actually investing in mining companies, to taking stakes in projects, to being able to provide offtakes, to building stockpiles. A tremendous renewed interest in government in these critical raw materials, recognizing the degree to which there is some real looming concerns, particularly from the perspective of the aerospace and defense sector, as well as for things like the energy transition. So from that, there's been over 450 policy interventions. I think that was in the first 6 months of last year. So these are just kind of multiplying over time, which says that the government will be an increasing factor in the industry, regardless of the perspective of whether or not the mining sector wants that. Both governments and mining companies are going to have to work together along with local communities to bring about projects. So how does that supply and demand balance look now? We're going to have a lot more presentation on this later today. But I think what we can see is that if we look at the high case of supply, so all of those announced projects that people talk about and say, wow, look at this huge project pipeline. If we really believe that, we would say actually the world probably is on target for most commodities. Not all, but most. But what we can see is in the real world, mining projects, it's not 100% do not actually convert, and 100% do not convert on time. So as a result of that, in our base case supply, we still see looming deficits across a lot of the major commodities. This should trigger further investment, but also a realization that both the financing community as well as governments will need to support mining companies to be able to realize these projects, whether that's permitting, whether that's incentives. Further actions required in order to ensure that there's a balanced supply chain. So what's beyond that? What's the whole super region about? So the super region basically, as originally conceived, was Africa, Central Asia, Western Asia, and parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. We are now expanding that to also include Latin America and a broader swath of the developing world. And just to look at that narrower subset on the right-hand side, this super region is already a critical supplier of many raw materials. So whether that be cobalt in batteries from the DRC, whether that be things like tantalum from the Great Lakes region, there's a tremendous amount of concentration of supply in the super region. Importantly, though, that is only part of the story, because that's current production. If we look from a resources perspective, typically most of the countries in the super region together have more resources as a percentage of global total than they're actually producing, which creates a huge opportunity for governments to be able to accelerate development, to be able to close that critical mineral gap, but also through a full value chain development, recognizing it's not only about the upstream, but it's also about developing downstream industries and partnering with some of the consuming countries. So maybe a little bit about the FMF barometer before I talk a little bit about what's next on the agenda for FMF. Importantly, the whole goal is to start with a fact base. So we're not just kind of starting with perceptions. There are a lot of other reports about that. This starts with the view that we need to start with the facts around the infrastructure, around talent, around all the enablers and what the baseline looks like. And this FMF Barometer, the inaugural edition, was all about setting the baseline. Moving forward, we're going to be tracking progress. And what does that progress tracking look like? It's going to be looking at the ramp up in supply and in both demand as well as in supply. It's going to look at the increase in mine development and full value chain development within the super region, which is the major priority region for the FMF Barometer. It's also going to basically be tracking the progress on realizing these enablers. And in many cases, FMF itself will actually play a key role in being able to get these enablers online. Whether it's supporting things like water, ensuring sufficient water supply in Latin America for lithium, and thinking about the cross-country infrastructure requirement. Whether that's thinking about green power in DRC and Zambia and the Copper Belt. Whether that's thinking about traceability, whether that's for copper or tin, tantalum, or tungsten. For all of these minerals, that traceability standard is increasingly important from the perspective of end consumers, and also for the countries themselves to make sure that they are that is part of the official sector of the economy, and not a part of, and not just being kind of brought about by artisanal miners without the right kind of standards to also make sure that local communities benefit. Finally, there's the dashboard. So it's not only about the facts, but the dashboard to track those facts over time and the progress. And finally, stakeholder engagement. We are going to have to monitor how stakeholders perceive the mining industry. If we can't get younger talent more interested in the sector, there's going to be an increasing shortage of production simply because you can't find the workers. Or there'll at least be an escalation of cost. There is also going to be a need to be able to track the perception of local communities. I led a roundtable yesterday that was all focused around local communities and the challenges they pose towards mine development, with very clear views on both sides in the right, but recognizing there needs to be a much more of a collaborative effort and a multilateral effort to be able to ensure the benefit of the mining sector, both for the companies and the countries, but also the local communities. So in terms of what's next, we're going to have a series of sessions after this one. In terms of those sessions, we're going to start out actually by trying to understand leadership perspectives. So we're going to have leaders coming online to talk about their view on how the sector is actually evolving and the state of the sector today from the perspective of being able to contribute towards future mineral supply. We're then going to shift on after those leadership perspectives to talk about the sentiment survey and also the critical minerals framework itself, and how FMF is trying to actually bring all of the discussion that we've had for 5 years towards concrete action and track that over time. So it's been a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you very much, and we look forward to everyone reading through the barometer, having questions, and being part of this global discussion about how to realize the security and mineral value chains globally. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Aldo Panini. I am the Director of Strategy, Program and Content for the Future Minerals Forum. I have the pleasure in moderating, apart from running around and ensuring that the event is a success, I have the pleasure in moderating this panel discussion with three friends. And what we're going to try and do, building on what Jeffrey Lork just outlined with regards to the Future Minerals Barometer, is gauge perspectives on this document from leaders in the minerals space that have been involved in some way in the FMF work, and to ultimately get a sense of the usefulness or the impact this document could have for mineral delivery, and in particular its usefulness for leaders to take into consideration in their decision making. So before we go forward, I'd like to introduce on my left His Excellency Moses Ngadu, the Secretary General of the Africa Minerals Strategy Group, Patrick Lehay, Managing Partner for Mining and Metals, McKinsey and Company, and Cyrus Hemanek, Senior Managing Director for M. Klein and Company. So gentlemen, welcome. Perhaps just to build on what Jeffrey just outlined with regards to the Future Minerals Barometer, to give you a bit of an outline of where this idea of a barometer came from and why FMF is producing such a barometer. Yesterday, FMF had convened, welcomed 100 governments, plus almost 60 international organizations, industry associations, as well as senior leaders from the mining world, to the Ministerial Roundtable, its 5th edition. And the audience was presented with this Future Minerals Barometer, as well as a draft Future Minerals Framework, which aims to shape and structure global discussion to increase mineral supply in the coming years. Over the past 4 years, and more recently 3 years, the FMF has been undertaking work on 3 key initiatives arising from this ministerial roundtable. Those initiatives are: number 1, funding of infrastructure to enable mineral supply; number 2, developing a sustainability framework in order to enable more responsible supply, and in particular, working with the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, to develop an international traceability standard for copper. Third is the development of a network of centers of excellence with the aim of building capacity for mineral supply in what we call the super region, which covers the whole of Africa, Western Asia, Central Asia, and also Latin America, particularly South America, given the geological links between the African continent and the South American continent. So it's a big ambition from FMF. The barometer will accompany the Future Minerals Framework as the tracking mechanism for mineral supply. Jeffrey alluded to the various elements of the report, and I think Cyrus has a copy of it very diligently, so it's real. And he's also said that it's accessible, so it's not something that that will be a burden. But the aim of this report is to be a tool that decision makers in government and industry will actually look to for information that helps the decision-making processes. So it's a big ambition, and we're hoping that this document will provide practical assistance. Beyond that, and before I start the conversation with our panelists, there are 6 key enablers, just to remind everybody, that is driving the work of FMF, and in particular this Future Minerals Framework. It includes geology, increasing exploration globally, and in particular the seven priority mineral value chains that have been identified largely through the work of the McKinsey & Company group. So 5 of those priority value chains are in Africa and 2 of those in South America. Copper being top of the list in Africa, lithium in South America. And so geology, exploration, key enabler, funding of mining development, another, funding of infrastructure, a third, enabling technology and innovation, responsible supply, policy, key element in mineral delivery, and talent development. We need more young people to come into the sector in order to deliver the mines and the products that are needed. So that's the framing of the conversation. And the idea of the panel here is to generate some leadership discussions, get perspectives from the leaders on stage around a couple of things. One is, based on what we just outlined and the knowledge of FMF and the work, what's in the report, is this the data or is the content of such a report useful, right? And I think, Cyrus, you and I had a brief conversation. Cyrus being a leading investor. Is this something that the investor world will be keen to pick up? Secondly, obtain perspectives on any one of the enablers in their report and delve deeper into each of those. So if I could kick off the conversation with His Excellency Moses Ngadu. And by the way, please feel free to give a brief introduction on yourselves and your obviously organizations if need be. As you're introducing yourselves, think about this report and the work FMF is doing and whether what's in it is relevant, useful for key decision makers. Your Excellency.
Hello, can you hear me? Well, Aldo has already done the introduction. I usually wonder what he wants me to say next. But just to say that the Africa Mineral Strategy Group was established actually on the sidelines of the Ministerial Roundtable of FMF 2024 by African governments to consolidate the way Africa approaches its mineral governance, mineral diplomacy, and ultimately ensure that Africa's minerals benefit its people. So it is an intergovernmental organization and a continental specialized agency for critical minerals. Should I continue or they introduce themselves first?
Oh, maybe just go through across the panel and then we'll come back to answer the question. So Patrick, yeah, over to you, just a bit more background and then
So
Cyrus.
thank you, and congratulations on FMF and the convening power. I'm quite impressed actually how this forum is bringing together leaders from across the world that are going to be instrumental to the challenges that you're framing. So I'm Patrick Lahaye. As Aldo alluded to, I lead McKinsey's global metals and mining practice, and I look forward to exchanging with you on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Aldo, and congratulations on 5 years. I've seen the conference grow from a small conference to becoming a world-class conference here. and having more than 25,000 people, that's a big achievement. So I'm Cyrus Hiramanik, Senior Managing Director at M. Klein & Company. We're a boutique investment bank. We've been working in Saudi Arabia for some time now, responsible for the Aramco IPO, doing lots of things in Kingdom and seeing the Kingdom, shape and grow. So it's very exciting times.
Excellent. So, gentlemen, is this data helpful perspectives from your source?
Yeah, thank you, Aldo. I first want to give a little bit of the context of why we even need, the report and data. We all agree that the life we live today is now more digital in nature. And as we continue, we can not possibly survive without the digital tools, AI, data centers, the energy transition. All of these things require, if we are to meet the demand, collaboration. And collaboration is what really brings us to FMF, to be able to figure out how do we achieve this together. We know that to be able to be successful, whether it's private sector or it's government, it's important to understand what are the needs, what are the requirements, what do we need to unlock. So the report that was presented gives us this very important tool that provides measurable milestones that we can choose to either work together or even collect individually to be able to achieve that. As we look forward to the needs that require to be met, the supply, as speaking from supplier countries, it's very important that we unlock the enablers. The enablers, beginning with geology, is all about data. So this data for decision making is very critical. What has been happening is that all of us have been pushing in a direction, sort of say, going blind. So what the barometer is trying to show us is to point out what are the criticalities that need to be, where should we prioritize our efforts, where should we prioritize our resources. And I believe as leaders, as governments, our duty is essentially to take this data, this report, and be able to bring it at the level of policy harmonization. Being able to look at things not just from the lens of governance, but also from the market and from the trends, looking at how does that then help us to unlock investment, how does that help us to bring critical partnerships for infrastructure. There is a huge issue around the new mineral economy. How do we prepare, the young people? How do we build the capacities of our countries, of our private sector, of everyone to ensure that we take advantage of that? So for us, the report is more like a guiding light. It's really to help to trigger things that need to be handled, but it also, of course, requires the actual implementation. There's lots of data and reports that have gathered dust, for a very long time. And part of our partnerships with FMF is really to ensure that we translate this from the document, from the data, the insights, to execution at country level. And it's very informative when our policymakers our countries are able to get reliable data. Getting reliable data has been a challenge for a long time because most of the data in the mineral sector is proprietary. Every company wants to use it to an edge, to be able to be profitable, to make ends meet.
Exactly.
But here we are trying to say, can we make this as data for public good? And with that, we can then be able to get more people coming to the sector. We can be able to address the establishment of resilient value chains, and we believe that as we continue with insights and be able to inform industry, there will be a benefit and we'll have more better policies that are made by governments, better lead implementation time, and hopefully it doesn't become expensive because it's available, and
Exactly.
that then will be able to help to ensure that we're bringing more people into the sector. I know McKinsey and the rest will be able to, be telling us that the inclusion and participation in the mining sector is dwindling because it's very expensive to acquire data, and data that will help you to make final investment decision. So with the platform of FMF, we believe that we will be able to use the barometer, but especially our interest is in the geology and investment and infrastructure.
Well, maybe we can come back to some of these points, Moses, as we look a bit deeper into each of those enablers. And I know AMSG has been particularly interested in the traceability and the responsible supply of minerals. But Patrick, if I can bring you in now in terms of the usefulness of such a report, you mix with, as you do, Cyrus, with global leaders, with people in the industry, with those decision makers. So any reflections on that data piece?
Thank you. So our sector is facing quite severe challenges in a time of opportunity. And I find that this report comes at a very timely moment. The reality is that when you look at our metals and mining sector, Jeffrey alluded to supply not meeting demand in many commodities, not all, but many commodities. There's also a geopolitical fragmentation that's happening in our world that is a big shift from what we've been essentially living for the past few decades. And in addition to that, if you look at all of the different industry sectors in the world, and you would essentially plot them with respect to productivity, where do you think metals and mining comes? It's next to last being construction, which is actually quite important for metals and mining as well. And so I don't say this to be alarmist. I love this sector, but it is a sector that is facing pretty significant challenges in terms of fulfilling some of the outcomes that we all aspire to. And so how does this link back to this report? There are some significant elements of change that need to happen if we are going to succeed in providing the world with the critical minerals that are required. Moses, you pointed out collaboration. I'd like to go back to that point. The reality is that no one alone will be able to do this. Not one country, not one company, not one service firm, not one investor. It requires a disproportionate amount of collaboration that we haven't seen in the past. I think the themes of the report are all the right ones. If I were to be blunt, that's the easy part, coming up with the ideas. I think we should not be naive with the fact that this is hard. And so as we were preparing for this panel, we talked about how are we going to measure progress on this? How are we going to be able to lift the mirror to ourselves, all of the different stakeholders, from the countries where the resources are, to the investors that want to essentially make this happen, the operators that bring the skills, all of them together. Will we be able to actually leverage these thoughts, look ourselves in the mirror, and assess the progress? Because this is not going to be easy, but it does require collaboration. And I think that this is a first step to at least painting the stage on what needs to happen. I think coming back to this convening power, all of the right stakeholders are here. And so how do we leverage a forum like FMF to be able to, next year, for example, take stock on progress, but have the real hard conversations on what did not happen, why is that, and what do we need to change next year? I think there's a real opportunity for that.
That's a great, great segue then to, Patrick, thank you to Cyrus and your initial impressions of the report. You've had a chance to have a flick through it as an investor looking for opportunities. Maybe just to preface some of these also by saying that one of the objectives of the report is to paint a more realistic picture of supplier nations. Country risk is a significant challenge, and so as an investor who needs to have the confidence necessary to invest in this sector, what are your initial reflections on this?
So I think my initial reactions on the report are, there's a lot of data out there. There's macro level data, there's micro level data, there's geology data. I think the good thing that the report does is it synthesizes all of that. It's not just focused on one, because as you think about decision makers, they want synthesis, and the report is good, but if it is going to be a continuously living document, just publishing one report that somebody is going to read at FMF, I don't think is helpful. But if you have this barometer on a quarterly basis, or at least a biannual basis, then it becomes a living document that people could actually use in the future. So I think that piece of it is the important part. It's a good report. It synthesizes things. It's easy to distill, and it addresses all of the challenges and the concerns. And to my esteemed colleagues, they raise the right questions in terms of, how all of this going to come together. From an investor perspective, a lot of people forget. Investors like taking risk. What they don't like is unbounded risk. They don't like uncertainty. And the data, if you have the right data and you can quantify risk, that will determine whether something is investable or not investable. And most of the time in mining projects, the uninvestability comes from more on the policy side, that investors will say, I can take commodity price risk, but I'm not going to take policy risk. That's the key piece that, some projects get funded and others don't. But we can get more into that, and let the conversation flow.
That's great. And one thing I should mention is the idea behind this report is for it to become an annual publication. So the 2025 edition, the inaugural edition, sets somewhat of a baseline, Patrick, I think to your point, from which to track progress or otherwise across these 6 enablers. So as we go back to these enablers, and then putting your hats on as global, regional leaders, bringing that global, local perspective to this conversation, what are the key enablers for you? And where do you see those going? What are the key challenges there? Would you find this report a helpful tool to help manage or identify or track some of those shifts? Moses, can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I guess let me start with the report in the context of what it does and what's going to help to do. One of the critical things is the narrative, at least from the perspective of Africa. The narrative about Africa, African investment policy, the mining environment, and our good friend is talking about policy risk. When you go across the continent, all the countries for the last decade have actually done very good investor-friendly policy, and the environment is enabling. But then you have these issues to do with conflict, disease, what the media has essentially published, that almost you can't do business in Africa or you can't get your profits out. So part of what the report is doing is actually to be able to demystify that, to be able to provide data and statistics. One of the things that we're concerned about is ensuring that the data that's coming, especially out of Africa, is actually contributed by Africa. Okay, because sometimes when we are doing these studies, they're based on different realities. So it's important that as we go on, as it becomes a living document, we actually be able to go to the ground. Now, when it comes to the key enablers, and as I said, we have the geopolitical situation today. and everybody is really scrambling for critical minerals. Fortunately, Africa has vast, mineral reserves, but that's operating at less than 20% of the geology that has been discovered. So our first and important part, I was having an engagement with the European Union, and they were telling us, okay, is Africa China leaning? And I simply told them, the problem is that everybody right now is looking at Africa as though for a bride who is spoken for. Why don't we come together, provide the resources, so we do more geological exploration, so we're able to discover much more than what currently is being scrambled for. So our focus is that we need to do geology and government-led geology. But this is an effort that has to be both public and private sector, in terms of that. And then the second part is the issue of infrastructure, because we know we can't achieve mineral value additional mining development or processing when there is no infrastructure, when there is no energy, when there is no water. So we need to ensure, in fact, today we just finished a roundtable, with the World Bank, and at the Africa Leadership Roundtable, the focus was unlocking funding for infrastructure. How do we bring the private sector to look at this as an enabler to invest in critical infrastructure, not just in the mining and mining development? Obviously, as a continent, we have the youngest population in the world. Africa is over 1.5 billion, but more than 70% is under 35. So that's both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is, with our efforts on mineral value addition, we'll be able to create multiple jobs. This is a young population that is uptaking technology at rates not seen before. When you're looking at, as investors, the jobs or the employees of the future, Africa is your frontier. So we need to look at talent, to be able to address this. We have focused on the last 2 years around policy harmonization to address and de-risk and boost investor confidence. But now we are looking at the elements of talent. How do we build capacity? As I said, infrastructure, and of course, the issue of data, because once you have that, the investment will come in. What Africa is looking for is win-win-win partnerships.
So maybe just to bring, Cyrus, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say, while I agree with you, I think what has happened in the past, and this is not just Africa, but in mineral-rich countries, you've had very good policy, but the policy implementation hasn't happened. And then what has happened is that there's policy, and then the policy radically changes when somebody has invested $5 billion in an asset, and that asset gets expropriated. And unfortunately, what happens is that investors have a long memory, and they don't forget about that. So once one negative event happens, it takes a long time for governments to get investors excited back into the region. So I think what needs to happen as policymakers, as you're thinking about the right policy as enabler, but you also have to think about, as you roll out that policy, to investors, you have to show success. You have to have maybe smaller projects that are going to be successful, so then you can build larger projects. And then lastly, just one other point just to address, everybody is currently talking about greenfield exploration. The issue with greenfield exploration is, yes, it's very exciting, but there is massive capital constraint. Investors don't want to fund greenfield exploration. So if you want to fund greenfield exploration, it has to be that partnership. Governments have to take on geological survey, help the wildcatters come in and have an environment where there can be some risk sharing. Because if you don't have that environment, it's going to be very hard for capital to flow in.
So there's a couple of good points here. And Patrick, first of all, you're which of the enablers you feel you'd want to sort of delve deeper into? But also, if you could have a think about this comment by Moses around data from Africa, right? The African voice, the African perspective. And then to Cyrus's point around risk sharing, which is the crux of partnership. Yeah, if you could just take a few moments to talk through all of that.
Absolutely. All the enablers matter, but I think 3 are unlocks that are required and that will actually, naturally get the others to flow in. I think it starts with policy. I 100% agree. The reality is that we need more stability in terms of investment geographies. But not only that, we also need policy to enable faster execution. And this is not just in Africa or in other countries that were part of the super regions. It's also true in developed regions take the United States. Right now, we're hearing lots of talk with respect to accelerating permits. Where are the proof cases that this is working? What are we doing different? And so I do think that policy needs to go in action to, satisfy investors with some stability, but also accelerate the development and create an environment where not only investors, but also operators will want to go in. So that's the first thing, and it has to start there. But that's obviously not enough. I think the second element, which is really, really key, is partnerships. And partnerships brings a couple of these enablers together. I alluded to this a bit earlier. Nobody's going to be able to do this alone. There are some really good examples of partnerships and collaborations of major institutions with, from the West with, for example, Chinese corporations that join forces in Africa and make things happen faster and better because they bring different skill sets. The reality is that when you look at project development, cost and time of project development sucks. It's really not good. And so how do we bring forces together and best practices that actually, through partnerships, will make it work? That's the second for me. And then the third one is talent and the workforce. I actually think that rather than looking at this as a challenge we need to fix, I think we should be looking at it as an opportunity to inject new workforce in our sector, and by the way, in parallel, develop new jobs and new skill sets for geographies that don't have those now. So, for example, take African countries that are resource rich. There is a pool of potential talent in those geographies that need to be developed, skill-based, so that they actually enable the development of these projects and operations of these projects, and that stays behind and completely changes the dynamic in those economies. So I see that as a real opportunity. Those 3 things to me are the priorities. If those are fixed, the money will come from investors. Technology, yes, technology is super important, but you know what? Technology is actually quite available. And so as we get more innovation in the sector, all of these projects, they're not going to forget to actually bring in technology. But if we don't fix policy, if we don't fix these partnerships, and if we don't actually develop the talent workforce to deliver, it's not going to work.
Exactly. And Cyrus, we don't have that much time, right? The world demands minerals. You take the risk. It takes, in the US, an average of 28 years, we heard today, to get a project going. Yesterday at the Ministerial Roundtable, we heard 18 years. 10 years ago, that number was 7 years. So we're heading in the wrong direction. Your perspectives as an investor on these enablers, and then I'd like to come back to the Africa question, but let's hear from you.
So I think that's why you see where the capital flows. The capital always flows to, first and foremost, brownfield projects. When commodity price, because we have commodity cycles, and generally the cycle lasts 3 to 5 years. So if you think about greenfield development, if it's 7 years, 10 years, 18 years, you pick a number, say you get permitted to build a mine on average, a large scale mine, it takes about 3 to 4 years to get it first production. So you now in first production, you had done your economics at X commodity price. Now the commodity price is down and your rate of returns all go away. That's why investors prefer short duration. That's why you got to fix the returns if you want large-scale projects, investors to come in large-scale projects. So how do we fix returns? How do we make sure that people can appreciate and diversify some of that commodity risk to enable that? But I think all of that sort of lies in policy and framework and partnerships. And I think, people blame lots of governments, but I think the mining companies or companies have some blame too. I think to have a win-win partnership, you have to build communities, you have to have the right systems in place so that the local communities benefit. Because once the local communities benefit, then you have long-term sustainability, long-term viability of projects, and success of the companies that are investing in these projects.
And so back to the Africa point, Moses, the report highlights that a lot of I won't give out percentages, but a lot of investment in minerals is going into, I would say, South America, rather than sort of, let's be more specific, South America, right? And although there's been an increase in the African continent, it's nowhere near that scale. Given the timing challenge that we have, the demand challenge, how are you seeing Africa closing some of those gaps? And back to the partnership point, does the whole thinking around Africa and how you work with Africa, how you help Africa need to change?
Well, I think it begins with Africa must fund Africa. We have a lot of capital and a lot of resources, and oftentimes we've witnessed wastages, we've witnessed corruption, and all of these things where this money should be used to sort of create this enabling environment that now investors are able to come in and be able to top that up. There is also a challenge that if today you put together, 100 top mining companies, all of them know or are close to the head of state or to the minister. That means they are not really focused on the regulation that comes to the policy implementation. Everybody wants to make friends with the top guys, and this is why there is no sustainability, because tomorrow if the government changes or if the president changes, then you have real problems. So one of the things that we are working on, as I said in the beginning, as part of our policy harmonization, I can categorically state that the policies that are being developed across the continent are forward-looking, investor-friendly. Now the next step we have to do is towards the implementation, so that we take away some of the bad practices that have existed, so that you guarantee your own investment because you've followed the law to the letter. Because there are situations that protect you. But if today you have gone to, higher authority who has directed, the department responsible, which then has skipped steps, to be able to give you, then the chances are high that you don't have protections. So what we are working on is to ensure, and this comes with the strategic partnerships, is to ensure that, I'll give an example. On exploration and geological surveys, we're working with Excalibur Smart Mapping as an example, and partner countries to raise resources towards the country mapping or the geological survey to at least help de-risk that process, that when you come in, you're not starting from the ground. But we have also worked with the countries to ensure that now they start what we call national mining companies, which then become your joint venture partners. So they take on the risk on behalf of the government or the government stake, so that the investor comes in and the projects are moving. Now we are, in most countries, we're now moving from the 18 years back towards the 7 years below. But what is lacking for Africa, in my view, is the promotion of what is happening, which is good. So you're left with what is known.
Sorry to interrupt, Patrick, but just to
Just how would you measure? I think those are all the right things, but what is the, how do you build investor confidence? How do you measure that?
And this is why we need McKinsey and FMF barometer. Now, those are the things that they need to be able to address, going forward, because we should not only be sharing the challenges, but also what are the things that are going well.
Yeah.
How is it being measured? If you look around most of the World Bank reporting, there are other different reports that are talking about investment climate and all of these things that should be able to do that.
And sorry, just Moses, to just give Patrick, you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, to come back to your question on how you measure, and back to my opening in terms of the opportunity, I think, with this convening power is, what if, for example, around forums like this, we make sure that the right stakeholders, and by stakeholders, it includes investors, it includes all of the different partners and governments that actually are involved in working together in building the supply in Africa today, to have open conversations on what's working and not. But that's going to require the courage to actually, get tough feedback and embrace it, and then drive change. And I don't know that that's happening at an ecosystem level today. It's for sure it's happening across partners that are collaborating together, because they have a common project and a common incentive, and they're invested, and for sure that's happening. But how do we, to your point, learn about those that actually have now invested, put mines into operations? They have learnings. Not everything worked well. And how do we share that back to the ecosystem so that, this is a continuous improvement cycle, and hopefully addresses some of the investor concerns as well? I don't know that forum exists, and could this be an opportunity to actually make that happen?
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, for Africa, Aldo and us have been working on what we call an FMF Africa special meeting, happening mid, the FMF for next year. And this becomes some of those platforms that we can then be able to bring these elements together. The reason why I said McKinsey is because when you look at each country report, every year, they are showing how much investment has gone in, which is in which mining sector, how many mines are live, which ones are being refurbished. Our headquarters in Uganda, and the copper and cobalt mine called Kilembe, which I think was run down about 20 years ago. Last year, there is a new joint venture partnership, and this year it's coming live. So there's a lot of these that are happening in Guinea, in Republic of Guinea, in Liberia, sort of like across the African landscape. And this is one of those things that MSG is going to do. But around the barometer, this is some of the things we want to start reporting, so that we can actually start showing things are much better than we perceive, and that there is a lot of traction and movement on the ground, because all the African governments have one singular problem: how do you solve the youth question? Because it's a huge risk, and in Africa we call them Gen Zs. As long as they do not, if they don't have jobs, they don't have all these things. And so the countries have taken their mineral wealth and tasked us to now say, how do we turn that, from a curse to a blessing? And this is why we're pushing for things like mineral value addition and all of these things. So my point is that we're working on a continental-wide strategy to build investor confidence. And one of those tools was traceability, and responsible sourcing through our blockchain. forums like this where we meet investors and countries showcase what they have. And ultimately, for me, what I'm looking at is what I call the farm tours. You know, getting investors and everybody just to come there and see, oh, how was this? I was here last 10 years. Today, if you go to most of those countries, there are very beautiful expressways, you know, railways being built. So all of this is an enabling infrastructure towards this. But the question is more about how do we change the narrative? This is why I said one of the values that we get from this report is changing that narrative, that when you see things about Africa that are surprising, you want to reach out more.
Not too surprised.
Maybe
Sorry.
just last 2 points. I think one on your having these national champions. I think building national champions is great, but a lot of the times where countries are building these national champions, they should bring something to the table, because what I've seen, you know, a lot of the national champion gets an asset, but the companies that are coming in, the foreign investors, are doing all the work and they're getting the benefit. So if the national champions can provide good trained labor, get other benefits that can be a true partnership, I think that would be great. But to end on, you know, at least from my perspective, on a positive
Just before you
note,
chime in, Cyrus, I'm just mindful of the time it's just raced through. So hold that thought, but in doing so, think about, is there a question that this conversation raises in your mind? Or is there something that this report should further include? Are there any gaps? And just a very brief comment on those two. And the same goes for Patrick and Moses.
So I think the one thing that, you know, the one thing that maybe for the next report, maybe have some investor engagement and feedback.
Okay.
And also some feedback from, and I don't know this, so maybe some feedback from the multilateral agencies that are helping, you know, investment in infrastructure and mining and projects. I think a little bit of that background and feedback would be good for an average investor who has access to the report and saying, oh, this is really happening in Africa. Because sometimes what happens is lack of information, that you can't find. There's a lot of data, but then there's not a lot of data.
Exactly.
So if that report can deliver that, that will be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Maybe to you, Patrick, and as you're thinking about those answers, this point that not just Moses, but a broader set of stakeholders has raised is frank conversation, balanced data, perceptions, myth busting. That's one of the issues that Africa sort of has to contend with. How do we move beyond the perception bit? So back to you.
So to your questions, the one thing that I would add to the enablers and to the report on a go-forward basis is a measure of productivity. I don't think we should take for granted, I mean, hopefully we don't take for granted our productivity, because else we're going to lose all our investors. So I would add that. Now, on a go-forward basis, to your question around how do we have the hard conversations and keep this super honest, I do think we should ask ourselves who are the right people to get in the room to raise the mirror to and to take stock about progress.
That's a great point.
Who are those people? And what's the forum in which we're going to have that conversation? And then what actions are going to come out of that?
Do you have an answer
I don't. I'm raising the question.
for the forum?
Well, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
I do think that this is a forum that can convene.
Yeah.
You know, so with respect to who, you need representation from all the different stakeholders, including investors,
Yeah.
all, including the the geographies as well and the governments, but the right individuals in each of these stakeholders, so that there is a forum that creates an environment of trust and confidence where we're trying to solve a problem together, so that everybody benefits essentially.
Right. And Moses, we have about a minute left. What's a question or something different that the report should be including?
Well, I think something different probably is we need to do more in-depth sort of super-regional analysis because the realities, the dynamics of sort of the mining and investment and sector, for instance, in Africa, is a bit different from Latin America and the other regions or Central and Western Asia. So being able to be deliberate to now take these major, sort of parameters, and then we test them throughout the year within the context of Africa, and then of course us doing those special meetings will help bring potentially the people that need to be in the room, but also being able to move away from high-level decision makers to sort of like the implementing entities. What everybody, for instance, in the context of governments, we have something called a civil service. So these guys are permanent and passionate about the laws. The Constitution gives them so much power than the political leadership. So you have the political will, but then the technical teams are the ones that create the bureaucracy, that create all these challenges. So some of these people need to be brought into the room to understand from their perspective, from their mindset. Our hope is that the barometer will lead to a bit of mindset change and a sense of the attitude in which we look at jurisdictions. And I hope, as we're discussing here, to say, rather than looking at things as challenges, we look at them as opportunities. There's two sides to the coin. And finally, for me, I take this as a way of saying you cannot clap with one hand.
Yeah.
You need both hands to clap. So this means that even this report is not an end itself. It has to become living. We must have, if not quarterly or rather monthly, at least quarterly insights, being able to continue feeding that data until next year when we look at it, we will begin to be happy because there's a lot we may not capture because one of the challenges of Africa is data gathering. You can't get data easily unless you come. People are a bit very shy with giving data. The investors or the corporate side are afraid they will be taxed more. There's all of these things. So we hope that this is a journey, not a destination, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. So however gaps and all of these things, it's always better to start, and then we take on from there.
Well, gentlemen, any final observations? Cyrus, and then I'm going to have to close it off because I'm being given the signal.
We should end on a positive note. The good news is, I've been in the commodity sector for 20 plus years. We've seen cycles, but this is a really interesting one because it's just not a commodity cycle, because this is an enablement cycle to green energy, to technology, and to the betterment of human life. And that has put critical raw materials, mining at the center of everything. So I think this is a big opportunity. And if we don't actually capitalize on this, and if governments don't capitalize on this, you're not going to get this again. So this is a time where people should really focus and deliver, because it's a great opportunity, not just for investors, but for governments and for other stakeholders.
Well, can I just say, firstly, thank you very much to, Patrick, anything else? Thank you very much to our three panelists. I think what you've witnessed over the last, and we've gone slightly over time, so we could have gone longer, is a role play of what decision makers, the type of conversations they'd be having when they have this thing in front of them, this future minerals barometer. It raises questions, excellent insights from each of the panelists. I encourage you to download the barometer. It's available via the app or the FMF website. It's all live. Feel free to comment on it, post on the website. But for now, I'd like to thank Cyrus, Patrick, and Moses for an excellent conversation. Thank you very much.
In Australia, you're... Sure.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as part of this State of the Sector session, where we'll explore the trends and developments that have helped shape and will continue to shape and influence the critical mineral markets. My name is Francesca Price. I'm a Senior Principal Analyst for Critical Mineral Markets at S&P Global. I'm going to start this afternoon's presentation and talk about the Mineral Price Index before handing over to my colleague, Orion Delanoux, an Executive Director for Critical Minerals and Energy Transition, also at S&P Global. He'll cover the deal flows and the exploration trends. We'll then hear from Marcelo Azevedo, Associate Partner at McKinsey & Company, who will lead on the end-user dynamics and the supply developments. So, the Mineral Price Index. If you have read the barometer, then you may recognize this chart. The Critical Minerals Index is based on S&P Platts Global Battery Metals Index. This was launched in October 2025 and represents the global price of Platts' key physical assessments of battery metals used in EV production. The index is a daily weighted average of price assessments for cobalt, manganese, nickel, and lithium, and the weighting of each commodity reflects its proportional weight of material consumed in an average NMC 811 battery. For lithium, Platts assumes an equal weighting between lithium spodumene and lithium hydroxide. So, methodology done. What has the index shown us so far? In the second half of 2024, the battery metals entered a really challenging market environment, largely marked and defined by oversupply for both lithium and nickel, and then compounded by weaker than anticipated EV and battery chemical demand. There was also quite a significant shift in market dynamics due to changes in battery technology, with LFP batteries increasing their share from 41% in 2023 up to 50% in 2024. NMC batteries therefore reduced their market share with a respective knock-on effect for nickel and cobalt demand. Moving into 2025, trade tensions and changes in US trade policies added to that slowing demand growth and supply surplus, resulting in what has been a fairly volatile and tumultuous year in the battery metal markets. So, extracting those individual price assessments, we can see that cobalt was by far and away the standout performer of 2025, with two steep step-ups, one in March and another in October. Lithium, nickel, and graphite, on the other hand, remained largely range-bound for much of the year, with a kind of a slight uptick just towards the end of the year. So over the course of 2025, the Platts assessed cobalt hydroxide price surged over 330%, and cobalt sulfate by around 280%. By contrast, the Platts assessed lithium hydroxide and carbonate prices closed the year just 50% higher after that late end-year rally. There was very little movement in the graphite market, closing the year almost where it started, while the Platts assessed nickel sulfate price roughly mirrored the pattern of the lithium market and closes just 50% higher compared to the start of the year. So, digging deeper into some of those trends and price drivers, with a particular focus on lithium and cobalt for the purpose of this session, being mindful of the focus on the super region. So, the cobalt market in 2025 has been largely defined by supply shocks, notably two, and both from the DRC. So, in February 2025, the DRC announced a 4-month export ban on cobalt, which was then extended again in June. The DRC is, of course, the leading producer of cobalt, accounting for around 75% of global supply. So naturally, this announcement resulted in a significant squeeze on spot availability and a respective surge in prices. Following that first ban in February, the Platts assessed China cobalt hydroxide price surged over 100% in that first 4-week window. With material shortages in the physical market and several refiners and manufacturers reporting and declaring force majeure. In September, the DRC shocked the market again when it replaced that export ban, but this time with a stringent quota, export quota, which was well below market expectations. The new system now limits annual export to 96,600 tonnes for 2026 and 2027, which is equivalent to roughly 50% of DRC's annual production. That announcement caused the second highest wave of price increases since that initial export ban in February, with reports of refinery inventories now reaching critical levels. So, moving on to lithium, a slightly different story. Lithium's price performance last year was very much a tale of two halves. So the first half of the year, as I've mentioned, defined largely by oversupply, continued oversupply, squeezing margins and share prices for miners globally and forcing some to curb output. We saw steep price drops between March and June before prices eventually bottomed out over the summer months. Compounding that, we had shaky consumer confidence among the major EV markets, which also weighed heavily on demand, with all regions sitting below neutral for most of the year. On top of that, we saw changes to automakers' EV strategies, rolling back EV targets, etc., owing to weak demand, and also reduced subsidies in North America and Europe. However, the picture began to change from around August for lithium, which saw supply disruption in China, including the closure of one of CATL's major mines, responsible for around 6% of annual supply. There was also regulatory changes in China to address overcapacity, and both of those combined caused an uptick in prices, with lithium carbonate futures reaching an 8-month high. But lithium mining continues to expand despite that low price environment, with new projects more than offsetting that China curtailment. We've also got strong growth forecast in Africa and the Americas. On the demand side, China's power sector reforms have helped to fuel stronger than expected demand for lithium used in batteries for power system storage, which is supporting a cautiously optimistic view moving into 2026, despite that prevailing weak EV demand. I hope that's helped to kind of contextualize some of the price trends that we've seen over the past year or so, and I'll pass over to my colleague Orion now, who'll explore more of the supply side developments. Thank you. It's just that green one.
Okay. Thanks, Francesca. My name is Orion Delanoux. I'm an executive director here at S&P Global, and I'm going to talk about, how do we, want to measure progress for development of the mining sectors in the super region. So, as Jeffrey mentioned earlier on, you need data, hard data, to be able to compare. And what we figured out here from a progress perspective is, you need to follow the money. So there's different ways of following the money. There's one, look at deal flow and M&A activity in the region. What are the transactions about? How much is being invested in transactions related to assets in those locations? And what are they looking for? And secondly, when it comes to exploration, so exploration spend is a huge metric that we're using for monitoring the jurisdiction and the ecosystem that support investments in the early stages of the metals mining sector. So we really look at exploration spend at S&P, and here we're going to show some of the early results here that we've seen for exploration spend, so which commodities are being invested into and which countries are being focused on. So if we look at M&A activity across 2025, it's a bit of a tale of two stories. On the left-hand side, you can see Africa spend, and on the right-hand side, you can see how much is spent on Latin America. And of course, I think for M&A activity, the big numbers in terms of dollars are mostly related to the big assets, right? So the assets that are already producing, that have a net positive cash flow, or very close to production. And so what that means here is that there's huge M&A activity in Latin America, especially on copper, because the copper sector in Latin America is very well developed. Comparatively speaking, there is some activity in Africa. So when we look at M&A activity, around 20 billion of the dollar transactions from M&A were targeting, Africa-related assets. On the right-hand side, what do you look at? So which is the buyer country? And I think there's no surprise here. Most of the mining companies are registered in the UK, Australia, Canada, or the US. So those are the leaders in terms of the M&A activity that's going on. But you can see that China and Saudi Arabia, for example, are present in the M&A market here for metals and mining assets. If you dig deeper on the super regions, and we've identified a couple of corridors, and you focus on the copper corridor in the DRC, what we can see here is that there's been a whole lot of activity in the DRC since 2015, in Zambia, and in Botswana, especially focused on copper. So, as we know, Tenke Fungurume, I'm always pronouncing it wrong, went through a big sales process in 2015, 2016, which were quite large transactions back then. And most recently, sovereign wealth funds like IHG, the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund, have invested in copper assets in Mopani in Zambia. And what this really shows, and we've seen the price of copper reaching $13,000 per ton last week, what we really see here is that there's a push for M&A activity focused on copper. I mean, the Rio Tinto Glencore deal that was talked about, I guess, not there yet, but that was talked about last week, is a testament that companies are looking at increasing their copper exposure. And when you look at the copper belt here, it's the next big thing when it comes to copper production beyond Latin America. So the focus for copper, right, it's strategic growth, alignment with the energy transition, and long-term growth in copper demand. When it comes to lithium, and this is another example, right, because the corridors, I think there's 9 identified, but we just wanted here to focus on lithium and copper because that's where we've seen the most of the deal activity that is high in sort of capital spend. We've seen a huge number of deals going on in the lithium triangle, mostly in Argentina with Rio Tinto entering Argentina with their acquisition of Arcadium Lithium. And when we look at the numbers, right, 56% of the world lithium reserves are in those 3 countries of the lithium triangle. So, even though the lithium industry has faced quite a few headwinds this year, it's getting better now, but it's faced a few headwinds in terms of pricing. The M&A activity in the last couple of years has been quite high in companies entering the lithium market. When we move to exploration spend, so I think it's important to notice if you have a long-term view and you're thinking about long-term development of the super region, you have to look at exploration activity. And you have to look at exploration spend because that spend is limited and it's very much dependent on the working environment and the ecosystem that the countries are providing to the explorers because, as we know, exploration spend is almost capital sunk until you make a discovery and the project is actually producing, which might take 10 to 15 years. So you've got to think about the long term here. And when we look at exploration spend activity over the last 10 years, 14 years, overall, it's not as high as the super cycle of mining that happened in 2012. So we've seen an increase in exploration spend. 2025 numbers just came out, and they're roughly the same as 2024. And when you look at the share of Latin America and Africa, it's about a 20% share of exploration spend in 2024. So it's not huge, but it's growing, right? And it's growing because of the commodities are focused and because of the prospects that Africa and Latin America continue to have from a mining background. What we looked at as well, drilling activity is also a good monitor of the health of the exploration industry. And as we've seen here, like when you compare Latin America and Africa to the rest of the world, there's a whole lot of drilling going on. And monitoring it from every 6 months basis or every year basis is important to just look at, okay, how much efforts are being invested by the miners and the juniors into that industry and into those locations. So these are our latest results in terms of exploration spend, and it's interesting to look at the change year on year. As we've discussed, it provides a view of what ecosystem and what commodities are being attractive for the investors, for the explorers. And there's going to be quite a number of interesting names out there, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia is a very interesting one, right? Because it's by far the largest growth compared to 2024, with over 100 million extra being spent on exploration this year compared to last year. Of course, on the scale perspective, it's still much smaller than some of the bigger countries like Australia, Canada, the US, or Brazil, which, as you can see, the budget change has gone quite negative, but it's still a much larger budget because those industries are much more sort of developed. So we see a lot of activity in Saudi Arabia, in Peru, in Chile. So those are part of the super regions. Côte d'Ivoire, Papua New Guinea, Suriname, Botswana are also, seeing increased growth in exploration activity. And so part of this is, what ecosystem do they live in? What ecosystem are they providing to the exploration companies? The other part is, what are junior companies exploring for? And, as you might expect, when you look at the prices of gold, the prices of copper, the prices of silver in 2025, those are the ones driving exploration spend. So we see an increase in exploration for gold. We see an increase in exploration for silver. We see an increase of exploration for copper. Copper is based on the long-term views, but gold and silver is very much based on price and price attraction. When you look at commodities, you also see that a tougher and the headwinds that we've seen in the EV market this year, the headwinds that we've seen in the nickel price, especially with Indonesia growing so fast, means that there's been quite a sizable decrease in exploration in lithium and in nickel, which are affecting some of the Argentina numbers, Brazil numbers, where lithium has been a big topic of conversation. So with that in mind, I think it's just important to reflect on the importance of data here to monitor progress, and I'll hand it over to Marcelo to talk about some of the end-use and supply dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just a green.
Just a green. Thank you, Orion and Francesca. Just a recap, I'm Marcelo Azevedo. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey & Company. I lead our market intelligence team called MindSpans and all things metals and mining. At McKinsey, I want to talk a little bit about demand, end-user dynamics, and supply developments. When I talk about demand, I always like to start with something that is predictable and unmovable, but often forgotten, which is demographics, right? Our sector has very healthy fundamentals, even if you didn't have everything we talk about energy transition and technology. Because in the next 25 years, the world is going to have roughly around 1.5 billion people more. Right? So even if you didn't have anything else, unless we change significantly how we build things, how we move people, there's a significant underlying demand fundamental around demographics. Now, on top of that, we have other things, right? So we have mobility. I know we've talked about a slowdown in EV adoption, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But still, between 2023 and 2024, we sold more than 3.5 million EVs more than the year before. Right? So when we slow down, it's slowing down in a very fast growth, right? So it's still quite positive. Third is AI, data, and advanced technologies, right? So we estimate roughly around 150 gigawatts of data centers between now and 2030, right? Which also has significant implications for materials. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And finally, security and defense, right? So we've heard a lot about defense budgets. From what we've been able to map, roughly $270 billion of global defense spending just between 2023 and 2024. which also adds another layer, again, on top of our initial demographics-driven fundamentals. If we talk about energy transition, EVs, as I said, we have seen a slowdown in growth in adoption. And what you have on the left-hand side here is the percentage of battery electric vehicles in the sales in different regions. We have seen a slowdown. Particularly, we've seen a slowdown versus previous expectations, right? But there was still a significant growth. Particularly if you look at the biggest market, that is the market that matters the most from an EV sales standpoint, which is China, right? We estimate that by 2024, you had almost a third of sales were battery electric vehicles. With a slowdown, of course, as we've talked, as Francesca mentioned earlier, around Europe and the US in particular. A similar story you can see in renewables, right? Even if we've seen a relative slowdown versus what was expected, we still have significant growth. And again, China is a standout. We still had significant build-out, for example, of solar in China in the last couple of years. So expectations have moved down a bit, but we still see a significant positive demand fundamental. If I look at data, we've worked with our energy team to try to estimate how much additional data center you're going to have to build over the next few years. And this is only until 2030. It's a growth of 3x. Now, I would probably assume we're underestimating this because we're over-indexed in a few regions which have more announcements on this. Right? So I think there's a lot that we don't know yet around other regions. What is India going to do, for example? What is some of Latin America is going to do, right? So this is very weighted towards North America and Asia Pacific, and China in particular. Now, obviously, material intensity is very different across for different metals in this. And this, for now, doesn't even include maintenance and replacement, as you need to build data centers that afterwards you need to keep maintaining them, because we haven't learned yet how much you're going to need. We estimate, for example, that you could add 1 million tons of annual copper demand by 2030. That's 3% of global copper demand, right? That's 1 year growth, right? So it's significant. It's very meaningful. It's very uncertain, right? So again, this comes on top of everything we talked about before. But there's uncertainty both on the left-hand side, there's uncertainty on the middle as well, because intensity of those things is probably going to change over time as we go build more. But it's meaningful, right? It is another sign of demand health of our sector. Now, if I combine all this, and this is very busy, if I combine all this, we actually see that demand outlook remains very resilient. So the world economy is material intensive. It will remain material intensive. In fact, the way we build things today, particularly with energy transition, we are more material intensive than we used to be, because we start using more battery materials in an EV, so the car becomes a bit heavier. The same for renewables. For every gigawatt that you add, you actually use more materials. Now, there's, of course, a lot of nuances in that, right? So substitution, thrifting, which materials are going to go where, recycling role. But as underlying demand growth, we remain a healthy sector. Just as an example, we see lithium is still a double-digit growth, even if they slow down with EVs. Graphite at 5% growth, roughly. Copper is still 2 to 3% growth. So it's still a positive story. Now, the colors here is we had done this same estimate 1 year before, and we saw some slowdown, right? So we see anything that is gray, we have a slightly lower demand growth outlook than what we had a year before. And this is partially driven by everything we talked about, right? So we talked about the slowdown in expectations for EVs and renewables. So there's been an impact that we're mostly growing. Now, on the supply side, in the earlier sessions, we talked a lot about partnerships, right? So we took a look at this, and we tried to put the facts on how much are people collaborating, how are people building assets. And we looked at what you have two bars for every region and a global one. The first bar is mining, number of new mining assets, and the second bar is number of new processing or refining assets. And what is the share of things built in partnership? Globally, it's over a third, for both mining and processing. So over a third of assets are built in at least two companies collaborating in building that. But you also have significant differences in different regions. Right? Caught my attention, for example, mining in sub-Saharan Africa is 2/3. You have multiple entities involved in this. You also have in Southeast Asia, which we have in rest of Asia there, the same. Right? In all the nickel complexes are often joint ventures. Right? So there is increasing collaboration, how things are being built. And this is very important because the structure of the sector has also changed a lot over the last 25 years. Jeffrey, my colleague, talked earlier about geographical concentration of things, but also fragmentation, who are the players involved in this. So how has the sector changed over the last 25 years? First, it has become more fragmented. If I look 25 years ago, the top 10 mining companies, metals and mining companies by market cap, were more than half of the sector. Today, you see here on the left-hand side, it's less than a third. Right? So you have become more fragmented. Second, regional representation has changed a lot, as one would expect. Right? The companies used to be mostly, you had a lot of Europe, for example, which has lost share. You had a significant growth in Chinese companies. I heard earlier today that I think Zijin now has a larger market cap than Rio. Right? So I think, for context, I think you've had significant growth in representation in companies from different geographies. And finally, because many of my colleagues have talked about the sector is material intensive, but the mix of those metals has changed because technologies have changed. So the commodity type has changed, right? So we still have lost share. Surprisingly, coal has gained share, right? Because you've seen a significant growth in coal in China over the last 25 years. Right? So the makeup of the sector has actually changed quite a bit over the last 25 years. Now, if I take our demand outlook and our supply outlook, because we want to talk also a little bit about supply, and Jeffrey also showed a version of this page earlier, there is still room for growth in supply, right? So what you have two columns here. The right-hand side, what we call high case supply, is if everything that is announced gets built, will the sector be balanced based on that demand outlook that we looked at? And for most of them, yes, right? So if you were to build that. Now, reality tells us that's not the case, right? Things are going to get delayed, things are going to get canceled, prices are going to move. So then the picture changes quite a bit, which is the left-hand side. For a lot of these commodities, you still need projects that are not advanced enough to advance, which is what we're calling the projects that are not in our base case supply. So things like uranium, things like magnetic rare earth, so manganese, even lithium, right? So I think we've had a down in prices, but demand outlook is quite healthy still. So if you don't keep building, in the shorter term, yes, the sector is still relatively undersupplied. Prices have recovered a bit, but it's relatively low versus historicals. But if you extend this by 10 years, the sector is going to keep growing, right? So you're still going to have to keep adding supply. Now, where is this going to come from? I think the good news is the super region is home to several critical minerals, right? So it will play a significant role in this. And here we just have a couple of examples, right? But obviously we talked about copper in DRC and in Latin America. But there's others, right? There's also lithium in the lithium triangle, as you guys talked about. There's rare earths in Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a number of graphite in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a significant amount of materials that is going to have to come from those regions. As my colleague Jeffrey mentioned earlier, we have a disproportionate representation in the super region for resource base that doesn't yet get translated into a proportion of how much is produced. So there's still an opportunity for that to come increasingly more from the super region. Thank you very much.
right, so good afternoon to the brave ones of you who are still in this room. Welcome to this panel where we will look into how can we make the FMF framework come alive. You know that, and also from the previous presentations and panels, that around the world the demand for critical minerals is accelerating faster than ever before, and for batteries and renewable energy systems to electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, the minerals we discuss in the FMF and in all the different sessions of the conference are central to energy security, digitization, industrial competitiveness. But while the global market is expanding, much of the value creation still happens far from where the resources are found. And this means also that, like, people who have the resources, they export them to then import the final products. The Future Minerals Forum has made it its mission to change that, and the Critical Minerals Framework is the FMF's flagship initiative to help countries and investors to work together, to build more resilient value chains that are also more transparent, more equitable. It's designed to connect the dots, to bring people together. We also saw in the Africa panel that there's work to be done on infrastructure, on processing, on mining. Now, again, as a reminder, the FMF framework is focused on 7 priority corridors, which the FMF calls the super region, which essentially spans Africa, South America, and the Middle East. And FMF wants to find ways to bring people together. And today we will explore how this can be done. How can we accelerate the development of these high-impact corridors? How can we turn opportunities into operational projects while taking care of still sustainability, competitiveness being in the money? And to help us unpack this, to make this come alive, to make this practical, we have here 2 people who are experts in the field. The first one is Louis Marichal. He's a senior advisor, minerals and extractives for OECD. Welcome, Louis. And then we have Michelle, and when we were preparing, she said, like, well, be careful because I may have a contrarian view from time to time. Michelle Vos, she's fellow in energy, minerals and materials in the Baker Institute. But I think, given the topic, I'm not worried about contrarian views because this is a difficult topic. This is the real thing of making it happen. And so let me ask you both first a question around what is exactly the problem that the FMF is trying to solve, or that, like, we're trying to talk about here. If you think about, like, there is already bilateral MOUs, there is already collaboration happening more maybe locally. So what exactly needs to be done beyond that, and how can this, in your view, be maybe translated into investable projects in 26, preferably? So maybe Louis, you start, and then
yeah, I'm happy to take a first crack. And I mean, stating the obvious, those corridors spans multiple jurisdictions. So bilateral MOUs are not enough to make sure that everyone's interests are represented and taken care of. So bilateral MOUs can help to some extent, but it's very useful to set up a multi-jurisdictional platform that can allow every voices to be heard and make sure that the good interest of all the producing countries and the transit countries as well are represented. I mean, you've started off by mentioning that those countries are looking at the mineral sector to become a true driver of economic growth. So that's not just mining, of course, that goes into value addition, but that goes into wider economic beneficiation, all the kind of linkages that you can imagine. So currently the OECD is undertaking a project looking at the Lobito corridor understanding how we can collectively maximize the impact of that corridor on local economies, which speaks to the kind of objectives that those countries have, and should also help with societal acceptation of those huge projects, huge infrastructure projects. But yeah, coming back to your question, the bilateral MOUs will never enable those kind of conversations that need to involve several countries that are impacted by those corridors.
Right. Very good. Michelle?
I would just add that when we think about these corridors, the locations of the resources relative to exits to markets require infrastructure that's going to cross territorial boundaries. So that's a big driver for a new way of thinking about things. Bilateral agreements don't really help with that. But I would also add, kind of in the bigger picture, we've been a knowledge partner with the FMF since the beginning. And clearly, from the point of view of investors here in the region, who are now outbound investors, not trying to attract investment here, but also being willing to look at and being very interested to look at projects abroad, they face the same risks as investors everywhere. So to the extent that you can get governments in these corridor locations to get on the same page about all of the basic infrastructure that you need in order to have a successful mining business, successful mining businesses, you're de-risking to some extent as a new player, and all of the businesses and the funds here in the region are definitely new players in this. So there's a real push, I think, to try to encourage a conversation that will satisfy both the needs in the locations, but also definitely the needs from the investor de-risking priority here.
Right. And so when we maybe bring it then to the broader value chain, right? Because I was also wondering a bit like, do you have like a favorite region where you believe like in 26 something more will happen than we have seen in the past? So how do you get from these corridors that in the end are supply regions to really global value chains? Right, like you talked, Michelle, about investors, but in the end, we want customers, right? And how do we have customers, de-risking the chain? And again, what is your favorite corridor, maybe to see action in 26?
I mean, looking beyond critical minerals, you have the Simandou corridor that's being developed in Guinea, but that's more around iron ore. But coming back to the Lobito and all the developments that we've seen recently with the Chinese corridor.
In Central Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Those will service markets either looking east or looking west, full of downstream companies that are in high demand for those materials. So that private sector component of the picture of the equation is absolutely central. But as we discussed in our prep meeting, I think that those private companies will not step in unless they see government action. And that's what we're starting seeing, again, with the Lobito corridor, and that we're seeing with the two other developments that are taking place in Central Africa. So the downstream perspective is essential, but I don't think they will be first goers.
Right. What is your favorite corridor to see action?
I don't have a favorite. My favorite is the one that will come together the best, fastest.
You will tell us at the end of 26.
No, but I mean, here's an interesting contrast. There's a lot of chatter in the United States about the prospects for a new aluminum smelter. The prospects for any kind of a new smelter in the United States are really pretty adventurous. But in this case, the Emirates are backing a project in Oklahoma. So one of the interesting things is for all of the aspirations in some of these more remote locations for a facility like that, you're looking at that investment location in Africa or Asia or Latin America, or whatever it is, versus Oklahoma in the United States. And that is the global competition. So I have no idea. I'm not putting my money on the Oklahoma bet yet. But I think you have to realize that's what the landscape looks like.
Just to further elaborate, I mean, you see it's already hard to convince downstream companies to secure offtake from mining projects. It's probably too much of an ask at this point in time to ask them to also take a stake or participation in huge corridors, infrastructure corridors. I don't think they're ready to do that at the moment. An interesting case study is the South Corridor exiting materials through South Africa, which has been struggling for a while, despite all the the demands and the requests and the private sector locally reaching out to South Africa to make sure that this corridor is revitalized. So again, I think they will gladly take the material, but they need governance and multilaterals and all of that to step in.
So you're saying it's already tough to ask a customer to, for instance, commit to an offtake agreement, let alone to let them also commit to being part of the infrastructure development that is needed to get the materials out. So if it's not the customer, who is taking the lead? Who should take the lead?
Again, I think it's quite instructive to see what's unfolding at the moment. It's really governments and multilateral and bilateral funding agencies that are stepping back into the conversation and taking the lead. And that's perhaps something that we'll come back to a bit later on in the conversation. But again, I think private sector is extremely glad and happy to join forces and play its part. But in particular, in those kind of complex jurisdiction, very complicated landscapes as well, the cost and logistical issues associated with these infrastructure corridors are so high that not a single company or a group of companies can take that on. They will help. They will, be a catalyst potentially sometimes, but you need a driver, and for the moment, those drivers are governments.
And so we're also saying that there's a role for the government to get things going. Is your view that there is much more of a role for the government because of course, the fact that bilateral and local initiatives are not enough, and we need to get the infrastructure built, which requires collaboration? But is it also because at this point, people are looking at projects for geopolitical reasons or for national development reasons, actually projects that are not in the money, but that still, are being pushed? Is that why the role of government and also development banks and so on is increasing?
I mean, clearly, that's a trend that you've been witnessing in the past couple of years, where this notion of security of supply has become so central that governments are now starting to get used to the idea that they'll need to come back and potentially spend some money supporting those projects, because otherwise the flow of materials will not successfully reach their markets. This market is not necessarily always profitable. So if you're expecting private sector to step in as a front runner, that might not just take place. And again, that's where governments and multilateral and international organizations have a role to play, supporting projects to be de-risked, and not just mining projects.
So I think there's two sides to this, though. So one is governments that are part of the flow of funds. So donor governments in the EU, United States, whatever, either individually or as part of World Bank initiatives or other things. And then there's the receiving donors, the receiving governments, right? And I think part of the pressure here, and I think part of the drive for the frameworks and the clear messages that are coming from the World Bank and other organizations is that those governments have responsibilities. So you look at something like Lobito, those governments have to actually help facilitate that project to get done. They have to make sure that people can build the rail, expand it, that it's going to be secure and safe and well managed, and that the money will be spent correctly, and all of the kinds of things, the governance things that can only happen in the location. And I think that is probably the bigger driver for these discussions, is the concern that on the receiving end, in terms of financial support and backing, that those governments can perform and are willing to perform and are willing to be accountable.
Just quickly, I remember when I started my career in this area 15 years ago, this notion of development corridors, in particular in Africa, was already well developed. UNECA did a whole lot of work, African Union. it never really took off. It took off 2-3 years ago because of the geopolitical divide in competition. So that's a clear signal. That's really what's driving the development of those corridors is a geopolitical push.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting point because Marcelo, in the previous session, was showing also some of the distribution of market caps between different regions, also where investments are going from the work. I'm also from McKinsey. I have been part of that work. We've been looking into it because we wanted to understand, who is now investing in what? But what you're also saying is we cannot just assume that what we see from the last 10, 15 years is going to be what we will see in the next 10, 15 years, right? That's what you're saying. So, Marcelo, maybe we have to do some thinking there to look forward rather than just look at the facts. Now, coming back to the fact that multiple governments need to come together, I think sometimes also multiple regions need to come together, multiple sectors need to come together, and then multiple stakeholders need to come together. How would you, and maybe also, Michel, you were in the preparation also saying you have seen many very unsuccessful cases, right? Like where people try to work together. But how would you split the risk between these different stakeholders, right? What can we learn from the past, maybe even from failures from the past, for successes of the future?
Boy, that's an art. That's not a science. Looking outside of mining, you look at some of the major agreements that got done and how hard it was to do this. So the Trans-Caspian Pipeline, for instance, that is a classic case study in the difficulty of negotiating across the different participants in the pipeline, who was responsible for what, who was going to get X amount of capacity, how the revenues from transit on the pipeline were going to get split. Every power pool that's ever been proposed has this problem in terms of, how the flow of funds is going to work, who's going to be responsible for what, how do you split the differences, and I don't think there's an answer. And also I think that the problem that everyone faces in all of these, which is why these ideas, development corridors, have been around for so long, and it just takes so long for them to get done, because interests shift. So whatever, to the point of, you can't count on what you saw in the past being the story going forward. Agendas change, politics change, positions change, agreements get restructured, or they fall apart, or whatever it is, and you learn that lesson over and over and over again. So you really have to be realistic. I don't know how to speed things up the way everybody is trying to do this week, and as everyone's talking about this, to accelerate it. I don't know how you accelerate it. This is human nature,
No, and these are extremely, as we said, complex projects, probably amongst the most complex. Again, because they span multiple jurisdictions, they require significant amounts of investments that potentially you won't be able to recoup within a reasonable time. I mean, that's the purpose of infrastructure. And again, this notion of risk sharing is really complex and probably needs to be approached on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you have a sort of a magical formula. But I think just clarifying, in particular governments, that this is a long-term initiative and a long-term endeavor may help convince investors in private sector that this is serious, and that they have all interest to join and support those initiatives.
Yeah.
By the way, in terms of the backers that come in, so if you look at, for instance, the United States or other partners, the European, either the EU itself or members that have participated in these complex deals, they also have the same burdens. Their agendas change, their politics change, different people are in charge, all of that sort of thing, and it's
yeah, I think this is a very good point. Brings us also to when these governments that we say need to step in because they need to create an environment that fosters, fosters collaboration, fosters others to come in. They also have their requirements. Brings us to the topic of how should traceability be included in these projects? How should centers of excellence be included? So, what's your view on these elements that like governments automatically bring in 2026 to the table as a return for their involvement?
It's actually a precondition now, but it's sometimes a precondition that's not really well perceived or well understood. It's one of those buzzwords. I mean, traceability is absolutely crucial. Don't get me wrong, but this has turned into a buzzword that some governments or some companies sometimes as well think are going to turn into a silver bullet and a panacea. Traceability, the notion and concept of traceability is simple, but achieving traceability is extremely complex. I think that's something that you can build over time if you have reasonable expectations. But if you set that as a condition from the get-go, it's a recipe for failure. I think the IEA and the OECD put out a report jointly last year. That's the starting point of the report is governments should have a clear understanding of the policy objective when they talk about traceability. And that's not there yet to begin with. The second point is that it's obviously even more challenging to achieve traceability in complex jurisdiction. And host countries and stakeholders in those countries are sometimes really, to speak bluntly, fed up with those expectations because they perceive this as market access restrictions. So there's a need for a lot of education, there's a need for a lot of consultation with stakeholders on the ground to understand what's the end goal, and more importantly, how you're going to get there, and clarify that it's not about excluding stakeholders in those countries, but it's about capacity building and over time making those supply chain more transparent and more accountable. That's when you look at the sort of responsible sourcing side of traceability. A big issue now comes from the fact that you have another set of stakeholders that are looking at traceability that are only really interested in custodianship of the material. Putting it bluntly, they want to make sure that the material they're sourcing is not controlled by a strategic competitor. That notion of traceability is vastly different from the first that we touched on. And that's why the OECD and IEA insist on the fact that you need to have a clear objective when you talk about traceability, because otherwise you confuse everyone. And you don't use the same tools to achieve traceability for responsible sourcing purposes than for security of supply purposes. To me, that's not quite clear yet in most of the conversations that I attend or that I'm part of. The confusion is really, really still very high, actually.
I guess the only things I would add to that, from the point of view of FMF organizationally here in the kingdom, the backers, the enablers, this is about assurance. So from their point of view, traceability, the first version of it, responsible sourcing, is all about that. And so it's a form of de-risking. I can be sure that this marked commodity meets the standards that have been developed, and I can trust in that, and therefore I can not only buy it, but I'll potentially take an investment position. So that's the whole point there. The problem, of course, is somebody's got to pay for it. So it's not clear that suppliers are really interested in doing that. The responsible sourcing and the standards are ultimately come back to the source government, the owner of the resource, to do their part to make sure that the standards are applied and respected and all of that. And the biggest problem of all commodities are different. So the mining industry is a collective of industries, right? So what works over here for phosphates is not going to work over here for cobalt, and this is a dilemma. So trying to think about this the way people are, it's this grand international scheme, really to me is not the right thing. I think on the Centers of Excellence idea, this is also a big imperative for FMF. The problem is that it's not clear what they are and who they are, and who's in charge, really, and how they are to exist, and then how the benefits from Centers of Excellence are supposed to flow back or flow out to the countries. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on that.
On the Centers of Excellence, I think one big added value is that they're truly implanted throughout the super region. So that really demonstrates that there's an expectation of ownership from countries or institutions across the continent. That's really good in terms of social acceptance and again, empowerment of partners. Just to come back on traceability / transparency, and that's something that we touched on in our prep meeting. We cannot emphasize how important it is at the moment also just to reassure prospective investors that don't like the mining sector, that don't like refining, that don't understand why they should put their money there. Because, I mean, as one investor put it to me like 2 years ago, if I have a choice between tech and mining, why the hell would I choose mining? And unless you can demonstrate that you have some sense of responsible business conduct in those investments, in those supply chains, it's just going to be impossible to demonstrate the added value of investing in those sectors.
And in that sense, so because you were talking also about like the governments, you said need to have reasonable expectations.
Yep.
So do you see examples of like where the expectations are reasonable and where the expectations are not reasonable?
That's an interesting question in the sense that the OECD has led the adoption of a due diligence standard that was 15 years ago, where it took us 2 years to negotiate that. And the expectations here are reasonable. But the result of that is that it's a long text full of recommendations, a bit complex. The way this standard has been used by a number of market players has become completely unreasonable. It's to some extent, it's become a tool to exclude supply chain actors, which it was never meant to be. So the tools and instruments exist. In some cases, I've known, we talk a lot to companies, we see companies trying to, as we put it, you can only change the situation if you're around the table, instead of getting out completely of supply chains that you think are too risky. So the tools and the instruments are there, but it's the implementation that is failing to a large extent. Now, the evolution of the situation is sort of encouraging in that sense, because companies throughout the world are pushed to take more risk than they were 5 years ago, because of all the consideration that we talked about. Our own governments are really pushing companies to be more involved. So that could be used as a leverage at some point. But so everything is there on paper, implementation sometimes lacking, often.
Understood, yeah. So if we go back to the industries, right, the businesses that are then part of this like coalition where multiple stakeholders need to come together. What would you, from your experience also in looking at the different stakeholders, what would you advise to the business people? And maybe let's first talk about the industrial people, right? The incumbents who are already in the sector, because you say like to attract investors is not so easy, but like those who are in there are probably having a certain affinity to looking for more opportunities. But what would you recommend them from your expertise, from your experience in working in the space?
I think the mining sector is obviously, as we all know, a long-term industry. And what we're missing sometimes on the part of the industry is this capacity to plan in the long term. And we've seen this from governments, in particular governments in Asia. The dominant position they've been able to build over time is because they had this forward-looking strategy. And that is something that I think to an important extent is missing in the business world at the moment. And it's changing, and I think it's changed in the past couple of years, but it will involve even more risk-taking than in the past, which is a point that I already sort of alluded to. But you have to be around the table at some point to dictate your terms or through negotiation achieve your objectives. What we've seen in the past 10 years is really companies in OECD markets to a large extent saying, I won't take your material unless it meets this and this and this criteria. But the world isn't listening anymore. The world is listening to players that are really proactively getting engaged in those supply chains. So my advice is, like, even if you start small, start now, because otherwise you'll be really left on the margins of the equation, and that's perhaps already too late to some extent for some players.
The thing about the mining industry is it's just so diverse. Big companies, small companies, specialist companies, multi-commodity companies, and so on. And I think it's also intensely competitive. And the larger companies, the global players, even some of the juniors, are bound by the regulations in their home countries. So whether it's antitrust, Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts, those kinds of things are going to impact greatly how they look at this. And I think my advice would be for them to be cautious, because we've had, over the years in different industries, as people have experimented with different things, we've had some good situations and good examples in which companies ventured into arrangements and then got burned by them, frankly. And so I think looking early is fine. So I'm going to be really contrarian here. Watching what's happening and how it's developing, but I wouldn't really take a stake until I kind of got more comfortable with it. And that's kind of what I see happening. Certainly when it comes to the conversations, people are very focused on the reputation of the business. You brought that up earlier today. And how to make sure that it's robust and it's safe. There's a warehouse, a reputational warehouse that can get built that works for all of this. But at the same time, watching this evolve and how it evolves and everything else, it's very not chaotic. That's not the right word, but certainly lots of players, lots of different interests, not least players that are pushing ideas because they think there's a benefit back to them as the traceability certifiers, and so on. And so I think the industry needs to be cautious.
Yeah. I think we talked before about there's multiple stakeholders and they have a starting position, starting benefits, as you say, like what do I want to get out? Now, over time, maybe their market grows faster, somebody else's market grows slower. So it's very difficult to keep like the win-wins at the same levels.
A question I have about all of this, because this has been a constant topic for a while now, but certainly I've heard a lot about it today. How do you help juniors get into the game, stay in the game, and so on? And I'm not sure this is advantageous to them. I mean, this is certainly a burden from the point of view of a pure junior exploration-focused, entity. And I think somebody has to think about that. If you want to impose standards and responsible sourcing and all of that, you're creating barriers to entry. So how do you overcome the barriers of entry so that you can make sure that you've got all of those folks that really are interested in taking the exploration risk, to get out there and do it?
If I can take a counterpoint to that, it's not really creating any problem for juniors involved in gold exploration, for instance. So I think if you have markets with really good financial...
That's a unique commodity. I mean...
No, I agree, but it's still pumping in over 50% of exploration spending. As much as the gold price will go up, you'll find junior raising capitals on all the stock exchanges. I think money talks...
Well,
really.
Someone actually said that to me. You could do this in gold. I mean, but the problem is everything else. I mean, that's.
And that comes back to the complexities of the various markets that we're talking about. And most of those critical markets are still, a number of them are still very small, very opaque, very hard to read, completely uncertain. So it's, again, very difficult to raise interest with investors if they don't have any kind of data or reassurances on where that's going to land at some point. That's the added value of gold. Like, gold is very liquid, it's quite transparent, it's a huge market. I mean, if you want to talk about rare earth elements, it's extremely small, so it's really going to be hard to attract investors. And just to finish on that, I mean, I would be very interested in looking at the actual costs of implementation of those standards. That's something that we've been trying to do at the OECD. It's very hard because companies won't share that. And it's also very hard because it's extremely complicated to put a number on those costs. So I'd be interested to look what actually puts those projects at a disadvantage. Is it really ESG expectations, or is it something else? And in particular in critical minerals, to some extent, it's also down to market manipulations and distortions that you can see on global markets. Having a comparative analysis of those two cost points, I think would be valuable.
I think the cost is, of course, one point. to determine whether, like, the project is in the money or not, right? Like this cost, and then of course many other costs, the core costs of the operation. I think the other question is, of course, and probably of an even bigger magnitude because of the uncertainty, is the risk, right? And how you are maybe able to de-risk with different stakeholders together versus, if you don't have those stakeholders, be in an structurally exposed situation.
And it's just also the access to capital. Like if you're not able to demonstrate that you're at least paying some attention to those considerations, at least in most OECD markets, you're not going to get access to capital, period. Not even talking about preferential rates or anything, but banks will not look at a project if it doesn't meet a certain number of international standards, which are not necessarily the most demanding, by the way. I mean, that's another conversation. But so that's an incentive to be taking those expectations seriously, because otherwise you won't open up the chest in the bank.
Right. Well, I think we've used our time. What I take away is that we've a lot of learnings from the past. This is a very complex setup with multiple stakeholders, each with their objectives, each with also sometimes unintended side effects of their involvement, right? So their intended involvement, their unintended, involvement, the evolution over time of these ventures. Obviously, the complexity is there, and that's why we're talking about it. But I also take away a couple of things from the discussion, is that it's very important for governments to get something going, to create the right environment where then the other stakeholders, the industrial players, other investors, and then maybe even like the development banks who are not the government itself, but have funds that they can help to use to de-risk. That the government starts, but that then the other players follow fast to get things done. And I liked one framing that you had, Louis, about the reasonable expectations, right? We all, and this is not only for governments, but we all need to have reasonable expectations and work from those. And then I think, Michel, you have given us several examples from your own experience where the trade-off, right, had to be found. When I ask you also, what is your advice? Well, they need to be careful. Careful is, of course, find the right trade-offs, not to act, but to act in a careful, right way. Thank you very much for the panel, and thank you all for joining us.